tell us a little bit about yourself, your educational and professional pathways, what brought you to where you are now.
Okay. Well, I'd like to say good evening to everyone. Thank you to Yale Blue Green and to YANA for hosting Sarah and me this evening. I hope everyone is feeling well and warm, especially if you're on the East Coast where it's really cold today. I consider myself an island girl. I was born on a Caribbean island, and I now live on the island of Manhattan. Sometimes it doesn't feel like an island because you don't really have great access to the water bodies on either side of the island. My undergraduate degree is in biology, and one of the formative experiences for me during that time was a semester abroad in Botswana. It was an ecology and conservation semester. And doing that sort of made me think about other pathways in the natural sciences. I had been on a pre-med track, and that experience really got me off that track in a big way. I'm a Yale FBS alum, at least when the school was FBS, Yale School of the Environment. And forgive me, I sort of always think of the school as the forestry school. But my experience at the Yale School of the Environment introduced me to community forestry in urban areas. And that was, for me, another really formative experience. It's sort of the time when I became incredibly focused on cities and urban forestry and the relationship between people and the environment. I worked for a bit as an urban forester in the city of Boston, and then I moved out to California and studied at Berkeley. It was in the landscape architecture and environmental planning program, but my focus there was urban forestry policy. And so I think my three academic experiences have been pretty foundational, sort of rounding out my views on the environment in cities and people and nature relationships broadly.
Lauren, thank you for joining us. I'm so glad. I would love to have you just say hello from Yale Blue Green, and we're delighted to be collaborating and co-sponsoring this program with you.
Thank you, Rachel. Wonderful to see you, Georgia and Sarah. Apologies for the slight lateness, was teaching. Wonderful to be here. I'm Lauren Graham. I'm a School of the Environment class of 2013 and the chair of Yale Blue Green. So for those who aren't familiar, we are the shared interest group that's open to any Yalie who has an interest in environment and sustainability. So it doesn't matter if that's your professional background or your academic background or neither. We welcome people from all walks of Yale life. As a community, we are spread across the country and also have chapters in the US and overseas. We run a pretty robust webinar program and enjoy co-sponsoring with organizations like YANA as well. And we also have an alumni board, and we have book club and other interesting ways for you to engage, including our most recent one, which is Cross Campus, which is run by the Alumni Association. It's a kind of a mix of a LinkedIn and a Facebook. So you're welcome as part of the Yale community to join our monthly call meetings where we highlight the great work of alums like Georgia and Sarah. And those are the third Wednesday of every month from 4 to 5 p.m. So happy to talk with anyone who is interested in finding out how to get more involved.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and for saying hello. And we'll be sure to have you, people can send chats since you're still panelists. I'm just going to move you off the screen for now. All right, Sarah, why don't you tell us where your path is to get here?
Sure. Well, I will also start by just saying I'm very excited to be here this evening, and thank you so much to YANA and to Yale Blue Green for the opportunity. And I always enjoy sharing the virtual stage with Georgia. So it's an all-around win from my perspective to get to spend an hour with all of you this evening. So in terms of my background, I grew up on the mainland in the Bronx of the United States. I had the interesting experience of being raised in the South Bronx and then in the North Central Bronx during the 1970s and 1980s by parents who were very active in social justice and public health without a real strong understanding of how those issues tied to environmental justice. I grew up in a neighborhood that was very park poor, and where access to the natural world wasn't really a part of my young life, but became a really important part of my young adult life when I left the city and attended college in upstate New York. And during that time, I studied economics and sort of slowly racked up a bunch of credits and ended up with a double major in environmental studies, and had a kind of burgeoning interest, but not a very clear understanding of what it could mean to work in the environmental field professionally. Spent almost a decade after college kind of finding a pathway towards that type of professional life. Worked for New York State, and then worked for a land conservation organization called Scenic Hudson, which is based in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I really fell in love with the outdoors in my 20s in a way that I think some people have the opportunity to do in their, childhood or teen years. But during that decade in which I lived and worked in a very rural area, I had a very strong awareness of the fact that while I was managing both small and large parks, all the way from Westchester County up to the Southern Adirondacks, I would spend days, sometimes weeks, working in parks where I saw few and sometimes no park users. So it was a very kind of inspiring set of landscapes, but in many ways, landscapes that felt sort of divorced from the human experience. And after my time at Yale, which was this really formative and incredibly rich learning opportunity, after having worked for a decade, I had the opportunity to join a couple of fellow alumni who were working at the Parks Department in New York City at the time to plan and then launch the organization of which I'm now the executive director of the Natural Areas Conservancy, which is focused on conducting scientific research and informing the care of natural habitats within initially the 5 boroughs of New York City, which has about 20,000 acres of forests and wetlands. And now we also run a national network which convenes natural resource managers from 12 US cities. And in this past decade, I would say I've really had the opportunity to marry together my love of the natural world with my love of New Yorkers and the people and places that really make this city so special, and to then take that passion and that information and to kind of use it as a platform for expanding an understanding of natural area conservation in cities across the country.
That's great. Thank you. We're going to get back to the organizations, and before I jump into your experiences at Yale, David, I see you joined us. We heard from Lauren Graham and wanted to give you the microphone to say hello and say anything about Yale Blue Green from your perspective.
And what was the last part?
About Yale Blue Green.
Okay, so I think I got that, and sorry for being a few minutes late. I just got finished, but by way of explaining, if I seem a little blabbering, I just got finished teaching a 3-hour course. So in sustainable design, and Sarah was here in New York, so we might have something to talk about. I hope so afterward. I love bringing in guests to my courses. So yeah, I'm an architect, among other things, and I teach and write about sustainable design at Parsons and at another school, New York School of Interior Design, where I direct a master's program. And I am a co-chair of the New York chapter of Yale Green. And let's see, what else do I want to mention? I was in Yale College, class of '78, so I'm an oldster. and majored there in, Sarah, I heard you say that you did a double major. I forget, I jumped in the middle of that. So I was majoring in architecture and economics, which added up to an interesting background. And what else? I think Lauren and Georgia, did you want me at this point to say anything about New York Yale Blue?
Particularly New York City, and Lauren said some nice, beautiful overview of Yale Blue Green, but there's anything particular about the chapter system or New York City chapter in particular?
Yeah, just briefly, if I can. One of the reasons I came into becoming a co-chair a bunch of years ago is that here in New York, we just have so many incredible people, you know, Yaleys and otherwise, working in all different areas of sustainability. And I think it would be incredible to bring together as many of those people as we can who are just, you know, all kinds of different fields in sustainability, and, you know, some doing some really remarkable things in some very impressive positions. And if we set up this network where we can all talk to each other, meet with each other, I think there's some really important things and creative and rewarding things that could come out of that networking. So that's what I think the chapter should be doing.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. I'm sure if anybody has questions, you'll be, because you are listed as a panelist, you'll be available in the chat. I'm just going to take you off screen so we can get back to our panelists. And thanks for joining us. And I hope we can do some more stuff with Yale Blue Green in the city chapter coming forward. All right. Wanted to get back. So Georgia and Sarah, you guys both have many things in common. Two specific ones are obviously your Yale School of Forest or School of Environment, which we still have to still call FES for short, forestry in New York City. So let's start with the School of the Environment. What led you there? You know, that particular school, when you did, and what did you find most useful about your time there? What was your experience like there, and how has it influenced you and what you do now? Georgia, you want to start?
Sure. I think I'll focus on the second part of that question. I'm not sure that I have like an inspirational answer for the first part. I was looking at a bunch of different schools, and I think really the reason I chose FES was on the recommendation of a friend who hadn't actually been to the forestry school as it was known then. He was a graduate of University of Montana, and he was a forester and just said, well, if you're gonna go to a school for grad school and your interest is in the environment, you're gonna want to, and you haven't applied to the University of Montana, you're gonna want to go to Yale FES. So that's my story. There were, thinking about that time, there are actually several moments that easily come to mind in terms of the most useful aspects of both my education and personal life. And so one is personal. Students go through mods, so it's this kind of a little bit of a training ground and introduction to what the school is about and sort of the skills that you can take a deeper dive in once you get there, or just a gentle introduction if you kind of have not much of an interest in the field skills that are offered through mods. And I think more than anything, it's just a way for students incoming to get to know each other, right? It's like not academic, it's very hands-on in like beautiful wooded landscapes. And I met lifelong friends there. I mean, it was just the friends I made during those weeks before classes start are some of my best friends right now. So mods are a highlight for me. Another highlight are the classes that had a really practical component. I remember doing archival work, looking at maps and records at a city building downtown. I think it was City Hall, and I was looking in their records department. And that skill came in handy for my current work, being able to go to an archive and sort of sift through decades and decades of maps and finding the materials that you need for a project. And that was just one example of a course that had a very practical component to it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention URI, which didn't happen during the 2 years of coursework, but happened the summer after graduation. And that's one of my regrets, that I actually didn't apply to be a community forester. I didn't apply to be a community forester with URI during the in-between summer, but only after graduation. That experience working with 7 community groups in a single neighborhood where they set the agenda for green space, both from the idea, the concept to the implementation, was profound, had a profound impact on the way that I thought about nature in cities, the way that I thought about how people had a real stake in the environment in their cities. It is a kind of touchstone in my life, URI. Another regret.
Or just for the audience, what is URI?
Oh, sorry. I just take it for granted. It's such a part of my life. Urban Resources Initiative. It's a joint organization between Yale and the city of New Haven. And the sort of ethos of URI is one of community and social forestry. And then you're welcome. A second regret would be I did a senior project instead of a senior thesis. When it was time to think about what to do in the second year, I didn't know that I would go on to a PhD program. So doing a senior thesis was not that appealing. And I really wish I had had that experience. And it is what it is, but those are some of the things I think about when I reflect on my time at the School of the Environment.
Becomes
Rachel, I think you may have lost your audio, or I can't. I'm going to jump in and answer the same question that Georgia just answered. I'm assuming that's the next step. So I'll say, I'll start with actually what led me to the Yale School of the Environment, which was a set of really important mentors in the time between undergrad and grad school. As I mentioned, I worked for almost a decade between completing undergrad and attending the Yale School of the Environment, which gave me a lot of opportunity to both try out kind of a professional path and learn what I did and didn't like about it, but also the opportunity to really meet people working in a lot of kind of affiliated career sectors, and to hear about and learn about their professional trajectories. So during my time at Scenic Hudson, the president of Scenic Hudson was an alumni of the joint degree program from the School of Management and the School of the Environment. And I also worked closely with folks from a range of other nonprofit and agency roles within the Hudson Valley who had gone to the school and had kind of studied really different things, kind of taken a lot of different paths, but each of them spoke very eloquently and with a lot of feeling about both the, to George's point, the social kind of bonds that they formed and the unique sort of culture and social identity of the school and the alumni network, but also about the educational experience of going to a school that was so singularly focused on environmental issues and with such a sort of deep bench of academic expertise available for students. So those things were both extremely appealing. I had an extremely positive experience during my time there. And it was, I feel like I kind of came in with a very sort of action-oriented approach of, like, I had like a checklist of, things I hadn't studied that I wanted to learn more about. And I kind of came in with this thought of, like, how can I gain the most knowledge during my time here? And I would say the social component, similar to what you described, was like sort of unexpected gift of that time. I made really, really close friendships, but also really, really close, what are now like deep professional bonds with people, both from my own year, but also from other years, both as an intern and then working part-time. My second year, I had the opportunity to TA several classes, which was a really great way to get, sort of more depth of experience with professors. And I took a lot of classes at other schools through the, offering of being able to take classes at the architecture school and the School of Management, and just found the entire experience to be extremely rewarding in this very well-rounded and well-balanced way, which was really meaningful. And then, as I mentioned, I had the really exciting opportunity. I returned to the Hudson Valley for about a year after I graduated, but then shortly after that, had this experience of coming to New York, and now, live and work with both a rich tapestry of friendships from that time, and also a very kind of strong and diverse professional network that was really seeded through that experience.
That's amazing. I think we just did a little career advice and a little pitch as to why, and I can see the application numbers for the School of the Environment now. Look, everybody gets a platform and you're part of the Yale community. So thank you for sharing that. All right, so let's move the actual work you're doing and where you're doing it. So if you can talk to Georgia about, you guys both work on these other, you guys describe them as sort of ends of the spectrum. We've got, Charlotte, Sarah, you're overseeing 20,000 acres, natural areas spread around. You get a lot of different things you get to touch on, but you may not get to actually go in and feel the leaves and put your feet in the mud every place. And there's pros and benefits and sort of challenges with that. In Georgia, you focus on a very specific, just under 10-acre, very specific park, but you're all focused in New York City. So, Georgia, if you can maybe talk a little bit about, the work that you do with your organization in the park, and what is it about that kind of an urban space and New York City in particular that makes what you're doing there unique? And then let's talk to Sarah about kind of what it looks like at the larger organization. So
Sure.
Georgia, kind of tell us a little bit about your park.
Sure. So my park and the park in which I work, Washington Square Park, is 9.75 acres to be exact. And the work is quite specific. We have a couple of different projects. One is a wildlife survey where the focus is really on birds. We have a phenology project where we are tracking seasonal changes in 13 trees within the park. We have an educational program, which prior to the pandemic, we popped up on our own or with a partner organization in 4 of the 5 boroughs in the city. We used study skins that my colleague and I made and brought them out to public spaces, from parks to streets to plazas. We never made it to Staten Island, unfortunately. It's challenging to bring everything you need, subway, ferry, and then a third mode once you get onto the island itself. And we recently started a podcast where we're collecting and sharing the stories that just everyday people have about their relationships with birds. So that's sort of the kind of in-house work. And then we've been partnering with the Inwood Hill Park Conservancy to offer bird tours during migration season. I know they're really trying to get a sense of the birds that visit that park, that landscape, and want to make it a bit more of a systematic count over the course of a year and over several years. We've also done a bird study last year at the Naval Cemetery landscape, again, to get a sense of where different bird species are in that park and the different microhabitats within that very small park. We also did something similar, but much shorter time frame and now I'm blanking on the wetland in Staten Island that is being destroyed as we speak, the Graniteville wetlands. We conducted a bird study for them as part of a tool that they were using in their advocacy to save that site from development. So this is all happening in Greenwich Village, which is a dense residential neighborhood in New York City. And I know when people, and this is definitely a perspective that's changing, it's in flux, but for a very long time, the concept of nature and city just seemed like an oxymoron, like terms like urban forestry, urban ecology, just seemed silly to put those two things together because the sort of premise, even when you think about the development of Central Park and its design, was very anti-city. Like you entered this pastoral landscape, the perimeter was planted with trees, the interior of winding serpentine pathways were in stark contrast to the surrounding grid. So even preserving or setting aside green space in early New York City was set against the very urban fabric of the city itself. But here we are, it's 2022 in New York City, and folks are embracing the fact that nature is bountiful in the city. And I know Sarah will talk about that because a lot of that is happening in natural areas that were preserved. But it's also happening in landscape parks. And we know that because over 100 species of birds have been cataloged using Washington Square Park, both in migration season and year round. We can talk about the over 300 species of trees in the park that represent 33 genera. Not all of those are native, and so one of the big pushes that we have is for local and regional diversity, not just in natural areas, but in our landscape parks as well. We know that while biodiversity is important, it matters what kind of diversity that is. And in landscape parks, it tends to be introduced species. We know that our local and regional native plants, which for terrestrial ecosystems, plants and trees are sort of the backbone of that. They do the heavy lifting, and our animal species, our native fauna really depend on our native plant species. So a biodiverse plant palette is going to give you more bang for the buck, and that's kind of a crass way of saying it, but a lot of city administrative decisions really come down to money and showing what biodiversity can do for the city, showing that sort of quantification and economic value. If you know that a truly biodiverse system is going to give you more co-benefits, then that's the way you want to go. That was the same sort of, this idea came out of work that was done in Chicago and then in LA and of course New York. New York City got a lot of money to plant 1 million trees because folks were able to show the economic benefits of planting those trees.
We're definitely going to get into access and equity and allocation of resources and stuff in a few questions. So thank you for bringing up those, where some of the decision making comes behind getting things to be planted in the first place in urban settings. But go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I like about this pairing, as you mentioned, Rachel, is that Georgia has the great fortune of working in a really place-based way in a park that I feel like she gets to experience day in, day out, kind of throughout all the seasons. And the way that the Natural Areas Conservancy works is a little bit more of a bird's eye view kind of approach to both understanding and then managing natural spaces. So for the first couple of years that the organization existed, the primary goal was to really understand natural areas within New York City in a way that mirrored the sort of best scientific knowledge about how to understand large rural landscapes, but to kind of take that rigor and methodology and apply them to the urban context. So for the first 2 years that we existed as an organization, we hired 25 research scientists and we deployed them across 10,000 acres, which is about a third of the city's park system, to do really intensive data collection, looking at forest health and forest composition, wetland health and wetland loss, grasslands and breeding birds, kind of this whole suite of in-depth studies. We also partnered with a team of social science researchers to really kind of dive deep into an understanding of who uses natural habitats in the city for recreation and what kinds of activities they undertake there. And I'll just mention a couple of like the very highest level kind of findings and then talk about how that has sort of shaped the approach that we take today. So that sort of initial work kind of shaped, but then has really influenced kind of a change in approach over the past decade. So at a really high level from an ecological perspective, what we learned was that the healthiest natural areas in New York City, so places like Inwood Hill Park in northern Manhattan, Van Cortlandt Park in the North Bronx, the Green Belt in Staten Island, which is a really large dedicated natural space in the center of that borough. In terms of composition and what grows there and what wildlife lives there are extremely similar to big natural areas in places like the Catskills and the Adirondacks. So we see similar ways that those systems work as systems, which is a little bit surprising, I think, for people who aren't expecting to find that within cities. So lots of diversity of native plants, lots of structural diversity, and a surprising ability to sort of self-perpetuate good health under the right conditions. We also found that from a social perspective, natural areas are really valued differently than other types of parkland, but there are also some similarities. So 50% of the people that we interviewed in our social assessments reported that urban natural areas within the city park system were the only place where they experienced wild nature in their lives. So people, half of New Yorkers as a sort of a representative sample, aren't leaving the city for kind of wild recreation experiences, to go hiking or to go camping. And it really invites this kind of mind shift away from the idea of urban parkland being the place where you recreate kind of day to day, and then other places as kind of the destination location where you go for a really wild kind of like transformative experience. We also found incredible benefits from an ecological perspective in terms of climate resilience and other sort of public benefits, including improvements to air quality, carbon capture, coastal protection from storms. So all of that stuff was kind of this like initial suite of findings, and it gave us this opportunity to really think about and shape an approach that now looks at continuing to invest in research as sort of one track, but then also focusing on two other really big kind of important pieces of work. One is, excuse me, as an educator and contributor to the green jobs and workforce kind of field. So we run a really competitive and robust internship program in partnership with the City University of New York, with a goal of creating a more direct pipeline for local young people into full-time jobs in the field of conservation. And then I can talk about this when we talk about access. We've also been very conscientious about expanding our focus from just understanding and thinking about how to best manage these places to also running a very comprehensive program focused on improving and expanding public access to natural spaces across the city.
Awesome.
And I'll save that one
We'll
for
definitely
your question about
return
access. Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, good. Okay, so thank you. And then let me shift back to Georgia, because you kind of started to get to this. We were talking about funding for planting and where things get going. So let's shift a little bit to, what is sort of access to nature, access to these spaces? We now know research is that it's sounding like, the places within these urban communities listed in New York may be the only place. It's not just for recreating, it's where people are seeing wildlife and seeing trees, and they may be spending most of their time, or any of the time they spend outdoors in these cities. So Georgia, I mean, you said you worked in Boston in urban programs, you've been in New York. Talk a little bit about, what is in this urban context of what feeds into access to nature, and sort of equity and allocation of resources to make sure that those kinds of spaces are available to everyone.
Oh, that's a big question. I would say, just thinking about New York, the Parks Department budget, and if I get this wrong, I know Sarah will let me know, is 0.5% of the city's budget. And the Parks Department owns and manages 14% of the total land area in New York City. So there seems to be a real disparity between the amount of land that the Parks Department manages, plus the benefits that those landscapes provide, from social to biophysical, and then their budget, 0.5%. The new mayor, through lots of pressure from different quarters during his campaign, has committed to 1% of the city budget. That's an improvement, but it just really, I think, is not reflecting the realities of managing 14% of the city's land area. And you'll find that then what that means is some neighborhood parks, some playgrounds don't get the attention they deserve for long periods of time. Certainly, and we can go back to Central Park, because I think for folks who maybe don't live in New York City, that's just like an easy park to think about. That park has a conservancy that has a very large endowment. And so they can cover the slack in the city budget, right? But other neighborhood parks don't have a community that can give to the same level that the folks who give to Central Park can give. So they have to rely on that baseline city funding, which is really stretched thin over 5 boroughs. And so, and even beyond that, some areas just, they have more political clout. They have more financial clout. So even if their park doesn't have a conservancy, more resources might just be directed there because of that sort of like push and pull between neighborhoods and city hall and city council members. And certainly having a larger budget, a more transparent way of dispersing resources to our parks would go a long way to addressing some of the inequity. But I think it's not just a parks issue. There are many more actors and agencies that are involved in our public landscape, and the difference between a neighborhood having poorer resources, both in terms of a plant palette and hard infrastructure. I mean, it's not just a parks issue, it's much more comprehensive than that. And there are scholars and other folks in the city who have, to use Sarah's term, like a bird's eye view of this, and also a really grounded view. They're really fantastic environmental justice organizations in New York City that are decades old, that are working on the multiple challenges that are part of, you know, the umbrella of environmental justice.
Amazing. I remember when I was teaching in law school 20 years ago, environmental justice was just kind of coming out, because I was at a law school where students wanted to go, that worked with at Pace Law School in White Plains, and it was one of the top environmental law school programs. And this idea of sort of environmental justice was pretty new on the scene, as far as people were looking to, like, where are the jobs? And it seems like now there are more people, which is good, on the ground and starting this work up. And obviously there's still a lot to be done. And as you say, it's quite overlapping. I know you've written about some of those, you know, near the 10-minute walks and the nearness, and what different communities, is it safe or not to safe? And then even as more recently as the riots from the other summer and COVID, and what's getting blocked, things are being blocked for public health reasons, but really the other side of it is that people aren't able to get into a park, and there are other reasons underlying that. So thank you for bringing that to the surface as a real important part of the work that's related to what you do, but it has specialists now, which is good. And if there's anybody in the audience, you've got other ideas, you know, about those kinds of places, put that in. Anything else? So it sounds like it's a lot of, it's tied to housing, it's tied to funding, it's tied to a lot of things that school resources might go to if you happen to be in a community where there's a local community parent association that can raise a lot of money to provide the other things. You know, it's political will. It sounds like it's just a lot of things, but luckily there are people like you. How many of the city parks do you know of, the landscape ones, have private conservancies or with endowments?
I don't have a number off the top of my head. I mean, and this might be getting into the weeds, but the Conservancy to city relationship is mediated by a document known as an MOU. So different conservancies have different responsibilities toward a park. So using the example of Central Park, their MOU says they get to operate the park in addition to fundraising. Washington Square also has a conservancy, but their MOU is fundraising and organizing volunteers. So the sort of operations piece is missing from that MOU. You know, sort of related to actual literal physical access to a park or natural areas, you think about things like, well, is it a safe walk to that park? Is it a safe walk to that natural area? And then there's, once you enter the space, perceived fears of being in that space might limit one's access to that space. The safety might not just be like violence, but, you know, what's the condition of the sidewalk? Do I have to cross a major road? So if you take any element of this conversation, you can sort of, you know, create a pyramid, a matrix. There's so many ways to then subdivide each of these issues. There's a lot of work out there for folks.
Yes, and I was going to say there are some other urban planners out there who can, you know, type in some issues or resources or people who want to deep dive into that. I know there's some very interesting work being done on everything from traffic flow to, you know, being able to walk, as you said, traffic pattern, and to it's like, you can say, oh, there's a park and it's can handle X number of people within this neighborhood, but that doesn't tell the whole story, as you were saying. Like, do they have lights? Can you get there? You have to cross, Queens Boulevard or something. But thank you for raising all of these. Sarah, should we get back to and want to hear your thoughts about some of these issues related to access, equity, and allocation of resources in space?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll just piggyback on a couple of the things that Georgia said. So I think there's about 50 nonprofit organizations that have formal agreements with the city, either MOUs or MOAs, and those even within those organizations, it ranges from groups like the Central Park Conservancy or Friends of the High Line, with very large budgets, down to groups that are 501c3s and have formal agreements, but may not have any full-time paid staff. So groups like the Forest Park Trust, which has a purview of managing over 300 acres in central Queens, they are super scrappy, but they're all volunteer. And so it's a really big spectrum. And then there are hundreds of non-501c3 groups that operate in informal arrangements as volunteers or ambassadors or conducting public programming. So it's a incredibly rich and also an incredibly complex landscape of community engagement. And those differences are sometimes celebrated and sometimes I think kind of pitted against one another in terms of how the different groups are sort of viewed and operate within their kind of respective purview. So I'll just say we could have a whole conversation about that. It's I think endlessly fascinating and extremely complex. I will talk a little bit about physical access. I'm going to put two things in the chat. One is the link to my organization's sort of body of work related to trails. So I mentioned that we have about a third of the city's park system, so about 10,000 acres are natural areas. And even today, there's not uniform and consistent just basic access to those 10,000 acres. So there's just in the last few years, there's standard signage and wayfinding that's been approved by the Parks Department, but not every park that has a natural area has actually been improved and received signage and wayfinding. So it's a big initiative that we've been focused on is running a joint program with a team of colleagues at the Parks Department to map and then create a plan for which trails will stay, where new trails will be constructed, where trails will be closed, a process we call formalization, which is basically taking the existing footprint of trails within a park and then turning it into a forward-facing plan for what the trail system should look like there. And then the next step after that is actually physically improving the park, which is sometimes done by paid staff and sometimes done by volunteers or community groups. We run a really robust program called Super Stewards. So we train volunteers to independently independently, managing and overseeing trail segments that they adopt within a given park of their choosing. And then after that, there's a process of actually putting up signs in those parks, doing outreach to community members, and then getting those maps actually up onto a website or a, entrance sign. So it's in many cases, it's a multi-year process, and it's a process that is very inadequately funded from the public sector right now, but as of last year, we have a comprehensive plan for what it would take across the entire city to systematically improve public access across all 10,000 acres. And it's something that we do a lot of work on in our advocacy capacity to try to get that public sector investment put in place. The other thing I was going to link to is actually just one of many papers that I'm aware of on this topic. This paper is called Fear and Fascination, and it's actually some research about who uses trails and then barriers, both physical barriers and also sort of perceived or safety barriers to use of natural areas. And I think, you mentioned a lot of these things, Georgia, but it's like everything from, sort of cultural disconnects about the language that's used to the idea of calling things hikes and trails instead of calling them walks and paths. Like there's a language and kind of culture gap. There's a perception kind of gap about which places are and aren't safe. And then there's the reality of some places not being that safe because they're not well managed, they're not patrolled, there isn't a volume of visitation that really gives people that sense of kind of eyes and ears on the ground. And all of those things are, I would say, also part of kind of this diverse, set of approaches that are really needed to fully invite communities into these spaces. The one thing I wanted to mention, though, related to that is I mentioned that we did a study early on, this was 2013 and 2014, in which we found that 50% of New Yorkers reported their only place they spent time in nature was New York City parks. During the first year of the pandemic, we went back to a subset of those parks and re-interviewed park users, and visitation specifically to natural areas increased 65% in that first summer of COVID. So we know that there's been an organic kind of turning to our park system for a whole range of social, emotional, mental, familial benefits during this pandemic. And I do feel like we're in this really special moment right now where people are viewing open space and parkland differently. They view their relationship with these spaces differently. And we have this kind of political moment in which we are really working hard to represent that shift and to use it as a way to advocate for the investment that we think is needed.
I think one of my wrap-up questions at the end will be, what can people do? And I want to get to that, but Georgia, if you and your kids in the background, but Georgia, I wanted to just quickly pick up on something that Sarah had mentioned about some changes they found during the pandemic, in which obviously we've talked, a lot of people have been pretty cognizant of the fact that there have been access to parks being higher on people's lists. What are some other, I know, Georgia, you've done some pop-up education, you do education, you're on the ground. What are some of the challenges and opportunities that you've seen in your neighborhood in Washington Square Park during pandemic that maybe been surprising or different?
So in terms of the education program our organization offered, it has stalled really. I think it's all last summer we started offering the pop-ups with our longtime partner, but 2020 we didn't offer it, and 2021 it wasn't until the summer, and we're still trying to figure out how to get the collection out to folks. I mean, it's a really kind of intimate, crowded experience. You set up, people come, and in the past, and we experienced it again last summer, children are so attracted to this program. And children, even during a pandemic, because we were still in a pandemic last summer, don't have the same sense as adults about social distancing. And it doesn't feel right to offer the program and not be able to offer it in a way that supports spontaneity, both with the study skins that we use, and then the sort of interactions between the people who come and participate in the program. So we're still trying to figure that out. We did offer something online, And now I'm trying to, that was in the fall of 2020, and that was okay, but it was a very different experience. There's nothing like, at least in my book, like experiential learning. And we miss the kind of organic, a lot of the organic storytelling that arose out of those in-person experiences. So we're still working that out. We also lost some of our volunteers for the phenology study, but that's definitely picking up. I started picking up last fall and is continuing. And in terms of our wildlife survey, we've now got 2 dedicated folks on board, and it looks like there are a couple of other people who'd like to join as well. So I think as people are feeling more comfortable, they're raising their hands to volunteer for our program. And we continue to offer both tree tours and bird tours in the park.
And you're collecting stories. I saw that you've launched your bird story.
Yeah, so the idea for that podcast really came out of the education program that we were doing on the street. There are innumerable stories about New Yorkers and their experiences with nature. And I know that
Many funny, I would imagine.
some are funny, some are sad, but there are many. And you know, one of the things I love, and this came about during my graduate studies, is I love listening to people share their stories. And I love the podcast because it's just a way to just like sit there and let people talk about their experiences, and you like pull a little thread and like you sort of go off and you come back. It's a really wonderful experience, and I'm so glad that people trust me enough to tell me their stories and to share them out. And I think storytelling is quite a good strategy to develop, to sort of nurture advocacy, but also to strengthen it as well. You know, a lot of the learning that we do is peer-to-peer, even if we don't realize it. And storytelling is a form of peer-to-peer learning. And I think incorporating that more into conservation can sort of strengthen that work, especially in cities.
Got it. And while we're there, I'm going to wrap up with one last question for each of you. And when you're kind of leading into that with stories, and we want to invite people to contact you, we'll provide all these resources. But what would each of you do with $1 million grant to support your work? Again, not personally, but professionally. And then what can people in the audience do? Just quick, you know, we'll provide links and stuff, but just quickly, if they want to get more involved in the kind of work in your particular organization or the work that you do. So $1 million grant, and you can make it $10 million if that's your budget, and what can people do in the audience to help support and advocate for the kind of issues you're talking about? Go ahead, Georgia.
Oh, I'm gonna pass it to Sarah first, and then.
Okay, Sarah, you ready for this one?
Sure, yeah. So with $1 million grant, so we just recently completed a strategic plan, and one of the things that we've scoped that's a new area of work that we are actively fundraising for is to build on the success of our internship program, which we've now trained about 90 both undergraduate and graduate students, and I have to say I'm excited about this stat. We just finished doing a first ever alumni survey, and 80% of them have landed full-time jobs in New York City in the conservation field. We are seeking to launch a workforce training program that will sit side by side with that program. The current program we run trains people for more sort of research and natural resource management kind of jobs. And we're looking to do a field component for people who are interested in in crew-based work. So there's sort of 2 tracks right now, and we are currently meeting one, and we're looking to build a program to train people for the other. So that's where I would put $1 million, is scoping and then launching the pilot for that program. And there's so many ways to get involved. We have lots of programs that we offer, both experiential and educational, so people could sign up for our mailing list. And then if folks are interested in getting involved in a more neighborhood-based capacity, I'm also happy for folks to reach out to me using our website, and I'd be happy to direct people to groups in individual neighborhoods that are working on parks-related issues.
That's great. Thank you. And then we'll be supplying all sorts of information to everyone that they can click on these links and get to these sites. And I'm sure people will want to reach out to you as well. And spoken like a true executive director, you have to look. We are fundraising right now. All right, Georgia, I saw you put your link to the Washington Square Park Eco Projects website of yours. That's obviously where people can get involved and learn more. $1 million, what would you do?
It would be to implement something that we submitted a proposal to the David Prize, which we did not get. But the idea of creating a local nature lab system, and so which really focuses on biodiversity in small landscape parks. So creating a catalog of the biodiversity of New York City's small parks. So starting basically with the sort of tree cover. And then the second component of that would be cataloging a animal species of interest to particular parks. So in Washington Square Park, it was birds, because my colleague and I are very interested in that. We don't have an insect background, but folks in another park might be incredibly interested in insects. So then that would be the sort of second step that they would take. And then the third component of that would be then developing community science programs around the biodiversity catalog. And so we sort of see that as the model that we have in Washington Square Park, and sort of expanding that across other small landscape parks throughout the city, and seeing how that sort of prototype actually fleshes out on the ground, and what kind of, I guess, peer learning can happen amongst all the parks. So that would be $1 million, because you want to pay people to do work that they love.
That would be amazing. Well, we've gone just over our hour. I wanted to say thank you so much. I know we've really just touched on a few things. Any one of these we could deep dive into, and I hope we can have some further conversations, perhaps in collaboration with Yale Blue Green, and hopefully we'll get more people to show up in person and continue these. So thank you, both of you, for sharing your stories of where you got to, the work that you do, and some of these other issues that are related to much larger issues. I hope you all stay well and safe. Keep up the good work, and we hope to see you outside walking around. And if you're visiting or living in New York, please go visit one of the parks, Washington Square Park. Both of you guys have very good maps, different kinds of maps on your websites. I know Georgia painstaking with every tree map, which is amazing, and the stories of those. And Sarah, they've got GIS, GIS and Esri, I mean, a little bit broader scale, but all really interesting. And you can I would highly recommend looking at both of them. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you for joining us online. For those who are watching this video later program, let us know if there's anything else we can do to help spread the word and support each other's work. So we'll look forward to seeing you at another YANA program. Have a beautiful evening. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.